Kids, please come up front here. So make sure you can see the projector. We're gonna be looking at a couple of video clips, so make sure that you can see. So you might want to not sit right in front of the music stand there. But come on in, have a seat. It's good to see all of you. I'm really excited to have you here. So come on in, have a seat. All kids are welcome, kids of all ages, so come on in. Well, it's good to see you. We continue our series about Bad Luck Joe. And if you remember the story, Bad Luck Joe has had a bit of bad luck. And his brothers sold him into slavery. He was convicted of a crime he didn't commit. And now he's sitting in jail. And the story picks up 2 years he's been sitting in jail when something amazing happens, that God comes to Pharaoh and gives him 2 dreams. You guys know what a Pharaoh is? Raise your hand. Do you know what a Pharaoh is? What's a Pharaoh? He's a person that rules ancient Egypt. Well said. And so Pharaoh was given these 2 dreams, and as I thought about how am I going to describe these 2 scary dreams to a bunch of kids, I put a phone call out to my friends, Bob and Larry. And so Bob and Larry are going to help illustrate the dream, and then I'm going to ask you some questions about it. So can we roll film, please, Michael?
Yes, darling. Earlier today, I had the strangest dream. 7 cows sat on a hill, so big and fat, I got my grill. I was thinking about a barbecue. Then 7 scrawny ones came along, and go, the big fat cows were gone.
Oh, can you believe having a dream like that with 3 or 7 healthy cows are eaten up by 7 skinny and sickly cows? If you had a dream like that, what do you think that dream meant? What do you think? Any ideas what that dream meant? What do you think? A famine. I think you've heard this story before, haven't you? Good. That's right. 7 years. Well, I don't want to give away the whole story here, so let's watch and listen to Joseph interpret it.
Come on, start interpreting.
Well, it's really quite simple. The 7 fat cows mean 7 years of plenty are a-coming. More food than you can imagine. And the 7 skinny cows mean 7 years of terrible famine. Famine so bad, the good years will be all but forgotten.
Ho, ho, ho. Did you hear that? A famine. And now you used the word, and you kind of wrestled with it, but you came up with it. A famine is when it's so dry and windy and hot that the crops can't grow food for us, and that people go without any food, and it's really, really scary. So if you learned that a famine was going to happen, what things could you do today to prepare? Raise your hand, kids. What could you do? If you know a famine is coming, what sorts of things could you do? Judah? Eat everybody, unless it's really good, eat just a little bit every day, okay? Even, okay, what would you say? What would you have to do if a famine's coming? You get a lot of food, and what would you do with the food after you got it? What do you think? Store it up! I think she's heard this story before. Let's see what Larry suggests.
If this is true, what do we do?
Well, during the good years, you should store away as much food as possible to give back to the people during the 7 bad years. And Dodgeball City will be saved. Of course, you'll need someone with great organizational abilities to make sure it all works.
Archie, what's the state of your socket drawer?
A little disorganized, I'm afraid.
That's what I thought. Cucumber, you're in charge.
Excuse me.
Well, what are you doing standing around here? You got a city to save.
Yeah.
All right, so you're absolutely right that they're going to store up the food during the 7 good years, and so at the 7 famine years, they're going to have enough food to eat. So all of you are right on. And so what we're going to see today is that God works in all these ways to not only save Joseph and the people of Egypt, but we're going to find out in the next couple of weeks that God uses a dream like this that Pharaoh had to save the whole known world. So good job listening, guys. Here is a piece of candy before you return to your seats. All right. If you are preschool through ages 1st grade, you could go with Miss Renee to a rest stop with your parents, grandparents, uncles, significant caregiver, whoever may be here with the kids. Make sure you guys get permission first. While the kids are getting themselves situated, please open up your Bibles to the book of Genesis. We're going to be in chapter 41. So the kids are getting candy. If you missed the first few parts of this series, we're in part 5 today of Bad Luck Joe. And if you know the story, you know that Joseph was one of the youngest of 12 brothers, and he had 10 older brothers that were looking for candy and really wanted a good piece. No, that's not what happened. Did you guys find one? All right. All right, good. Good. Whenever it takes this long, you know I need to get better candy selection. All right, guys. They're storing up 7 years of candy, I'm sure. All right. So as I was saying, Joseph, favored by his father, was given this multicolored coat, right? And he made his brothers, 10 older brothers, jealous. They got so jealous that they assaulted him and they threw him into a pit and they sold him into slavery. And as a slave in Egypt, he started from a lowly slave and he became the ruler of a house. But then he was convicted of a crime he didn't commit, and now he's sitting in jail. But even in jail, the Lord was with him. And the Lord gave 2 different dreams to 2 different men, a cupbearer and a baker. Joseph had the amazing ability from God to interpret their dreams. The baker was going to lose his life, but the cupbearer would be restored. And as that man wandered out of the jail to be restored by the Pharaoh, he said, "Please don't forget about me. Remember me. Get me out of this pit." And day after day after day, for 2 years, Joseph sat in that prison, wondering where was God and what was God doing in his life. And so today's passage picks up the story as illustrated with the kids where Pharaoh had a dream. Now after he has the dream and he goes about the series of events we're going to see, Joseph does come and he does interpret the dream with God's help, and at the end of his interpretation he makes a statement. But before we look at that, we have to understand the entire series that we've been working through. We've been seeing on display what's called God's sovereignty. It's God's plan, God's will, God's power. Everything that happens in the world, from the acts of nations to the faith of individuals, is ultimately under God's sovereign control. And so maybe you've wrestled with this question. See, Joseph, when interpreting the dreams, he's going to say to Pharaoh, this matter, everything that's going to happen, has been firmly decided by God. And maybe you've been wrestling with this idea of God's sovereignty. Maybe this question came to mind. If God is sovereign and he has established everything that will come to pass, then what's the point, right? Why should we put any effort in this life if everything is already firmly decided by God? And this is what our confessions have to say about that. We believe that this good God, after creating all things, did not abandon them to chance or fortune, but leads and governs them according to his holy will, in such a way that nothing happens in this world without God's orderly arrangement. Yet God is not the author of and cannot be charged with the sin that occurs. For God's power and goodness are so great and incomprehensible that God arranges and does his works very well and justly, even when the devils and the wicked act unjustly. We do not wish to inquire with undue curiosity into what God does that surpasses human understanding and is beyond our ability to comprehend. But in all humility and reverence, we adore the just judgments of God, which are hidden from us, being content to be Christ's disciples so as to learn only what God shows us in the Word without going beyond those limits. And so keep that in mind as we wrestle with this passage today, starting with verse 1. It's a long passage, so please bear with me. Verse 1. When 2 full years had passed, Pharaoh had a dream. He was standing by the Nile when out of the river came up 7 cows, sleek and fat. And they grazed among the reeds. After them 7 other cows, ugly and gaunt, came out of the Nile and stood beside those on the riverbank. And the cows that were ugly and gaunt ate up the 7 sleek fat cows. Then Pharaoh woke up. He fell back to sleep again and had a second dream. 7 heads of grain, healthy and good, were growing on a single stalk. After them 7 other heads of grain sprouted, thin and scorched by the east wind. The thin heads of grain swallowed up the 7 healthy full heads. Then Pharaoh woke up. It had been a dream. Now in the morning his mind was troubled, as you can imagine. So he sent for all the magicians and the wise men of Egypt. Pharaoh told them his dreams, but not one could interpret them for him. At this point the chief cupbearer said to Pharaoh, "Today I am reminded of my shortcomings. Pharaoh was once angry with his servant, and he imprisoned me and the chief baker in the house of the captain guard. Each of us had a dream that same night, and each dream had a meaning of its own. Now there's a young Hebrew who was there with us, a servant of the captain of the guard. We told him our dreams, and he interpreted them for us, giving each man an interpretation of his dream. All things turned out exactly as he interpreted them to us. I was restored to my position, and that other man was hanged. So Pharaoh sent for Joseph. He was quickly brought from the dungeon. He came in and was shaved and changed his clothes. He came before Pharaoh. Pharaoh said to Joseph, I had a dream, and no one can interpret it, but I have heard it said that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it. I cannot do it, Joseph replied to the Pharaoh. But God will give Pharaoh the answer he desires. Pharaoh said to Joseph, in my dream I was standing on the bank of the Nile. When out of the river there came 7 cows, fat and sleek. They grazed among the reeds. After them, these 7 other cows came up. They were scrawny and very ugly and lean. I had never seen such ugly cows in all the land of Egypt. The lean, ugly cows ate up the 7 fat cows that came up first. And even though they ate them, no one could tell that they had done so, for they looked just as ugly as before. Then I woke up. In my dream I also saw 7 heads of grain, full and good, growing on a single stalk. After them 7 other heads sprouted, withered, and thinned, and scorched by the east wind. The thin heads of grain swallowed up the 7 good heads. I told this to the magicians, but none could explain it to me. Joseph then turned to Pharaoh and said, the dreams of Pharaoh are actually one and the same. God has revealed to Pharaoh what he's about to do. The 7 good cows are 7 years, and the 7 good heads of grain are 7 years. It's one and the same dream. The 7 lean, ugly cows that came up afterward in the 7 years, and so are the 7 worthless heads of grain scorched by the east wind. They are 7 years of famine. It is just as I said to Pharaoh. God has shown Pharaoh what he's about to do. 7 years of great abundance are coming throughout the land of Egypt, but 7 years of famine will follow them. Then all of the abundance of Egypt will be forgotten, and the famine will ravage the land. The abundance in the land will not be remembered, because the famine that follows will be so severe. The reason the dream was given to Pharaoh in 2 forms is that the matter has been firmly decided by God. God will do it soon. And now, let Pharaoh look for discerning and wise men to put in charge of his land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh appoint commissioners over the land to take 1/5 of the harvest of Egypt during the 7 years of abundance. They should collect all the food in the good years that are coming and store up the grain under the authority of Pharaoh to be kept in the cities for food. Now this food should then be held in reserve for the country to be used during the 7 years of famine that will come upon Egypt, so that the country may not be ruined by the famine. The plan seemed good to Pharaoh and to all of his officials. So Pharaoh asked them, well, can we find anyone like this man, one in whom is the Spirit of God? Pharaoh said to Joseph, since God has made all this known to you, there is no one so discerning and wise as you. You shall be in charge of my palace, and all my people will submit to your orders. Only with respect to the throne will I be greater than you. Think about the roller coaster ride poor bad luck Joe has been on, right? Taken away from his family, all this crazy stuff has happened to him, and now he's sitting there in jail. You know, you can imagine how this scene would be, right? It's this dark, dreary, sad place, and every day that goes by he kind of takes a rock and puts a mark. Day 1, day 2, for 2 whole years. Imagine how he probably started to lose hope, how he probably wrestled with what was God doing? Am I ever going to get out of here? When suddenly God steps into the whole situation. It's not like he's never been there, but he actively gives this pagan king 2 different dreams. Now this is amazing when you think about it, because in the Egyptian mind, Pharaoh was a living God. And here the one true God steps into history and gives this gentleman 2 dreams. Now as we think about what this must have been like, as he's having these dreams and he's awoken in the night, he has another dream and he's terrified, he goes to his paid professionals, right? We talked about this last week, that kings and queens in the ancient world had wise men, advisors, magicians, and so he calls all of his magicians together and says, all right, here's my dreams, waiting, because this is all they do, folks. This is what they get paid for, to interpret dreams, and they got nothing. Can you imagine how frustrated he was? And then at that point, the cupbearer, remember, is always standing right by Pharaoh. He says, oh, "Oh, I can't believe it. I totally forgot about this guy. There was this guy in the jail who interpreted my dream and the baker's dream, and everything came true." So Pharaoh right away, brings him up out of the jail, and I'm sure he didn't smell so good, so they washed him and they shaved him, and they put him before Pharaoh. And Pharaoh says to him, "Now I have heard it said that you can interpret these dreams." And look how Joseph responds. "I can't do it." Can you imagine? There was a gasp in the throne room, right? You could hear a pin drop. The whole reason he's not in jail is because he's supposed to interpret the dream, and he admits, "No, I can't." At that moment, Pharaoh could have said, "Off with his head. I don't want him in my sight." But look what Joseph says. Now wait a minute here. I can't, but God. And there Joseph used the Hebrew word Elohim. But God will give Pharaoh the answer he desires. Pharaoh said to Joseph, and then he goes through the whole dream. And again, this is not someone that knows who God is. This is not someone that's aware of everything that God has done. And yet after Joseph hears the dream, with the Lord's help, he points out that the two dreams are one dream. Remember back to Joseph, and in the first part of this, Joseph had two dreams. You remember? He had a dream of a bunch of wheat bowing down to him, which represented his brothers. And then he had stars that were bowing down to him that represented his brothers. Two separate dreams, one meaning. Now once again, Joseph realizes that these two separate dreams with the fat and skinny cows and the healthy and the withered grain is one and the same dream. There's going to be 7 years of abundance and 7 years of famine. So terrible is this famine, it's going to be forgotten all of the years of abundance. And we see that powerful statement that Joseph makes without a hint of insecurity. He says, all of these things is a matter that has been firmly decided by God. Can we have the next slide? There we see that powerful phrase that all of these things, 14 years later, it's all been firmly decided by God. The Hebrew word there for firmly decided is kun, which literally means that God has decreed this, that He has fixed this in time and space, and that these matters have been established by the sovereign God of the universe. Now, why would this be such a scary thing? Can we see the next slide? Each and every year, the Nile River, that's a picture of it, would flood its banks. And so water would go on both sides of the river. And as you can see, not only would it provide water for the crops, but it would also fertilize the crops with the silt that would come down the Nile River. In the ancient world, Egypt was the breadbasket that all of the surrounding kingdoms relied on. We know that Joseph's great-grandfather Abraham, when there was a famine in Canaan, traveled to Egypt because they had food. And if the one nation of the world that always provides food for all the other nation is destroyed, what's that going to happen to the future of not just Joseph, but the entire human civilization? If we could see the next slide here. Now let's just say, I don't know if you've heard this or not. I've heard it at hardware stores, heard it at outdoor shops, I've heard it at the gas station. Where I'll say, hey, how are you doing today? Oh, you youngster, you don't know what's coming. Like, whoa, sir, what's coming? Oh, I was just reading the Farmer's Almanac, and they're saying that this winter's going to be the worst winter ever since 1978. And then another guy was like, that's not true, it's going to be colder than the storm of 1936. Now I'm starting to get kind of scared. If you know that this is going to be a terrible winter, what sorts of things would you do, right? Maybe chop some firewood, get some bottles of water, get a generator, do all these things to prepare. But let's say that the entire country was relying on us to make sure that the corn that we grow around here is available in the winter. What would we do? We would build more bins and silos, wouldn't we? And so Joseph realizes that since the whole world is relying on Egypt, they need to start storing up the grain. And so he comes up with this wonderful idea to put someone in charge. And I don't think he was saying, you should put someone in charge. A guy that's really smart and handsome and clean-shaven. I don't think he was doing that. I think he was genuinely using the gifts that God has given him. Remember, his vocation and what he knew and the integrity of saying, this is what you need to do. And look at how Pharaoh responds. The plan seems good to Pharaoh and all of these paid officials. And look how Pharaoh describes Joseph. Can we find anyone like this man, one in whom is the Spirit of God? This is a living God in the eyes of the Egyptians. And he's declaring that Ruach, the spirit of Elohim, is in this particular person and no one else in the world. So why not would we put him in charge of not just storing grain, but be the second in command of all of Egypt? Could you imagine how Joseph was feeling? Earlier that day, he's wondering if he's ever going to get out of jail, and now he's second in charge of all of Egypt. Clearly, God was at work here. So if we could see the next slide, please. Again, maybe as we talk about God's sovereignty, you've been wrestling with this question. If God is sovereign and he has established everything that will come to pass, then what's the point, right? Why should we put any effort in this life if everything is already firmly decided by God? And one way to wrestle with this is the doctrine of what's called concurrence. And that describes the relationship between God's sovereignty and human volitional actions, what we do. Theologian R.C. Sproul, in his book, Does God Control Everything?, describes how the story of Joseph is his favorite example of concurrence. And then in the section where he says, meant it all for good. Listen to this. He asks the question, what would have happened in the history of the world if Jacob had not given Joseph a colorful coat? No coat, no jealousy. No jealousy, no treacherous sale of Joseph to the Midianite traders. No sale of Joseph to the Midianite traders, no descent into Egypt. No descent into Egypt, no meeting with Potiphar. No meeting with Potiphar, no trouble with his wife. No trouble with his wife, no imprisonment. No imprisonment, no interpretation of dreams of Pharaoh. No interpretation of dreams of Pharaoh, no elevation to the role of prime minister. No elevation to the role of prime minister, no reconciliation with his brothers, we're going to see in the next couple weeks. No reconciliation with his brothers, no migration of the Jewish people into Egypt. No migration of the Jewish into Egypt, no exodus out of Egypt. No exodus out of Egypt, no Moses, no law, no prophets, and no Christ. Do you think it was an accident in the plan of God that that coat happened? Of course not. God meant it all for good. And so I want to leave you with one other illustration. Maybe you're still wrestling with this idea of God's sovereignty. We see it work in today's passage. And you're wondering, well, what is the point? One of the reasons why I love this illustration and why we use it on the logo for our church is because it has great significance when it comes to explaining biblical principles. That I think we all know people in our lives, and maybe we're feeling like this, that it's sort of dark out. And we're wandering through this life and we don't know which way to go and we don't know our purpose and we don't understand what God is doing in our life. Maybe we don't even see the lines on the side of the road in this life. But we know that there comes a point in our life where the Lord comes to us, and by His Spirit, He changes our hearts to be turned towards the Lord. He changes us in such a way where we realize that we're wandering around in the dark, and we realize that we need a Savior. And we come to know that Jesus is the Savior, and we come to realize that we are bought and paid for by the blood of Christ. And when that happens, a change takes place. That all of a sudden, when we take that step of faith, we begin to see the road of life as God intended us. And we begin to see that every single step that we make is part of God's sovereign plan to not only bring redemption to our lives and those around us, but to bring redemption to the entire world. So what's the point? The point is He uses people like us. He uses people like Joseph in His sovereign plan to save the whole world. To go out and to tell people about who they are, who God has created them to be, and how there's a person named Jesus who gave His life so that we could live. And so I invite you to be praying about where is it in your life that you have to see this picture of a road. Where are you going to take a step of faith and follow the Lord wherever He calls you to go?